The cockpit of a Boeing 777 is a cold, calculated place. Every dial, every switch, every blinking light speaks the language of precision. There is no room for doubt here, no room for hesitation, and certainly, absolutely certainly, no room for love. Captain Ethan Cole knew this better than anyone. At 34, he had logged over 12,000 flight hours across 6 continents. He had landed in zero-visibility fog over Heathrow. He had guided a crippled aircraft through a Category 5 storm somewhere over the Pacific and walked away with nothing but a steady pulse and a slight craving for black coffee. Newspapers once called him the pilot who doesn't sweat. His fellow officers simply called him Ice. He liked that name. It suited him. Ice doesn't break, ice doesn't bend, and ice, most importantly, doesn't feel. His co-pilot, Marcus Webb, a round-faced, cheerful man from Atlanta who talked too much and laughed too loud, slid into the right seat of Flight AR-407 from New York to London and cracked his knuckles with theatrical drama. "Another day, another 30,000 feet, Marcus grinned. "You know what I love about this job, Ethan? The silence?" Ethan replied flatly, adjusting his headset. "The people, man. 240 beautiful human beings back there, all with stories. All with dreams." Marcus leaned back. "You ever think about that? Every single person on this plane is somebody to someone." Ethan didn't answer. He was already running pre-flight checks, numbers, systems, protocols, safe things. The boarding was nearly complete when the cockpit door opened and a flight attendant stepped in to confirm crew readiness. Standard procedure. Ethan didn't look up from his checklist. "Captain Cole," she said, her voice warm and unhurried, like sunlight moving slowly across a wooden floor. "All 242 passengers are seated. Crew is ready. We're good to go." "Thank you," he said, eyes still on the panel. There was a brief pause. Then she said, very quietly, not to him, but almost to herself, "Beautiful evening for flying." Something about the way she said it made him look up. She was already turning to leave. He caught only a fraction of her profile. Dark hair tucked neatly under her cap, the curve of a smile still fading from her lips as though she just remembered something that made her quietly happy. She moved with a kind of unhurried grace that seemed almost impossible in the narrow confines of a cockpit doorway. Then she was gone. Ethan stared at the empty doorway for exactly 2 seconds longer than he should have. Marcus, who missed absolutely nothing, raised one slow eyebrow. "Don't," Ethan said. Marcus smiled and said nothing, which was somehow worse. Flight AR-407 lifted off from JFK at 7:42 p.m., climbing through a bruised purple sky into the first scattered stars of evening. Below, the city dissolved into a glittering grid of light, then disappeared entirely beneath a thick white ocean of cloud. Cruising altitude, 30,000 feet. Outside temperature, minus 56 degrees Celsius. Inside Captain Ethan Cole's chest, something that had no place on any instrument panel. A flicker. He ignored it the way he ignored turbulence. Professionally. Completely. Or so he told himself. Her name was Sarah Malik, 28 years old. 4 years flying international routes for Atlantis Airways. Third generation from a family of teachers who had wanted her to become a professor, a doctor, perhaps a diplomat. Anything that kept her feet safely on solid ground. Sarah had other ideas. She had always believed that the sky was not an obstacle between places. It was a place in itself. The most honest place she had ever been. Up here, at 30,000 feet, stripped of traffic and noise and the relentless forward march of ordinary life, people became themselves. She had seen nervous businessmen weep quietly at sunrises. She had watched elderly couples hold hands through turbulence without saying a single word. She had once given her own jacket to a 10-year-old boy flying alone for the first time, and he had fallen asleep clutching it like a shield against the entire world. She loved this job, and she was exceptionally good at it, not because she followed procedure perfectly, though she did, but because she genuinely, deeply, unfailingly cared. About the passengers, about the crew, about, "Stop it, Sarah." She was in the galley, preparing the first round of drinks, when her colleague and closest friend Priya slid in beside her with the expression of someone holding a very exciting secret. "So, Priya whispered, eyes wide. You've met him. I've met the captain, Sarah said calmly. Yes. Captain Ethan Cole. The Ethan Cole. Do you know what they call him? Ice, Sarah said. I've heard. And? Sarah carefully arranged 12 glasses on the tray. And he seems like a very competent pilot. Priya stared at her. He looked at you, Sarah. Ethan Cole looked up from his checklist. Do you understand how historically unprecedented that is? I've been on 6 flights with that man, and he has never once, never, Priya, acknowledged the existence of anyone who wasn't a mechanical system or Marcus Webb. Priya. And he looked at you? I have drinks to deliver, Sarah said pleasantly, lifting the tray. And so do you. She walked out of the galley with perfect composure and allowed herself exactly one small smile that nobody saw. Over the next 2 hours, the flight settled into its quiet rhythm. Ethan found himself, and this was both irritating and inexplicable, noticing her. Not in a distracted way. Not in a way that compromised his focus on the aircraft, the instruments, the controlled airspace they were threading through at 560 miles per hour. He was a professional, and professionalism was the one religion he had never abandoned. But in the peripheral way that the mind catalogues things it finds interesting. She moved through the cabin the way water moves, finding the easiest path, never forcing, always present. He observed this through the slightly open cockpit door during Marcus's break. He noticed the way she crouched down to speak to a small child who was frightened, bringing herself to eye level without making it a performance. He noticed the way she somehow simultaneously managed to calm a difficult passenger in business class and communicate a quiet instruction to her colleague with nothing more than a glance. Competent, he thought. Then, reluctantly, more than competent. Marcus returned from his break, looked at Ethan, looked at the slightly open cockpit door, and absolutely did not say a single word. His silence, however, radiated satisfaction. It was during a routine cabin check at the 3-hour mark that Sarah found herself pausing outside the cockpit. The door was slightly ajar. She could see Captain Cole's profile, sharp jaw, dark eyes fixed on the instrument panel with the focused stillness of someone who was never, under any circumstances, anywhere but exactly where they needed to be. There was something almost severe about his concentration, something that should have been off-putting. It wasn't. She knocked gently. Captain, would you like coffee? He turned. And for the second time that evening, their eyes met properly. Black, he said. No sugar. I remember, she said without thinking, then immediately recognized that she had never brought him coffee before, and therefore could not possibly remember, and felt the precise warmth of embarrassment moving up the back of her neck. He caught it. She saw him catch it, and she saw, only for a fraction of a second, there and gone like a break in cloud cover, something warm move through his eyes. Thank you, Miss Malik, he said. She left the coffee. She walked back to the galley. She did not smile until she was completely out of sight. The coffee became a ritual. Every hour, on no particular schedule, she would appear at the cockpit door, sometimes with coffee, sometimes with the passenger manifest question, sometimes with nothing more than a brief, entirely professional exchange about altitude or estimated arrival time that somehow, despite its brevity and its technical nature, contained within it the texture of an entirely different conversation. Marcus watched all of this with the barely contained delight of a man witnessing a natural phenomenon. By the 5th hour, they had exchanged exactly one personal sentence each. Hers. I think the sky looks different on every flight, like it's never finished. His, after a pause so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. I used to think that too, before I stopped looking. She had stood very still in the cockpit doorway. Why did you stop? She asked. He was quiet, then, safer that way. She looked at him for a moment. Then very softly, as she turned to go, I don't think it is. It happened at hour 6, not the storm between them, though that was building steadily, quietly, with the particular inevitability of weather systems that have traveled very far to arrive exactly where they are. The other kind of storm. The kind that ends careers, the kind that ends lives. At 1:47 a.m., somewhere over the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, in the precise dead zone between the last American radar coverage and the first European, the aircraft's communication system went offline. Not turbulence, not a warning light. A complete, sudden, catastrophic failure of the primary and secondary communication arrays, followed 3 minutes later by a sharp, unexplained electrical surge that knocked out half the instrument panel and sent the aircraft into a shallow, uncontrolled descent before Ethan's hands were already moving, before the thought had fully formed, pulling her nose up with a muscle memory that had been built over 12,000 hours of exactly this. He leveled her out at 28,400 feet. Heart rate, he checked, elevated but controlled. Marcus was already running diagnostics, voice clipped and rapid. Primary comm down, secondary down, transponders intermittent. We are effectively invisible, Ethan. Altitude, stable. Engines nominal. But we've lost half the nav panel. Ethan stared at the darkened instruments. The aircraft was flying. She was stable, but they were blind, voiceless, and somewhere over 3,000 miles of open ocean with no ability to communicate with air traffic control, no ability to confirm their position with precision, and a cabin full of 242 people who were beginning to feel that something was wrong. Because passengers always know. Even before the announcement. Even before the change in engine note or the subtle shift in cabin pressure. They know, in that animal, prehistoric way, when the people responsible for their survival are worried. Sarah knew too. She appeared at the cockpit door, and one look at both pilots' faces told her everything. "What do we need?" she said. No panic, no performance of calm. Just the clean, direct question of someone ready to work. Ethan looked at her. For a man who prided himself on assessing situations in seconds, he found that he needed every one of those seconds in this particular moment, not to assess the situation, but to feel something that moved through him with startling force. Gratitude. Not for anything she had said, just for the way she had said it. What do we need? Not what's happening, not are we going to crash, not should I tell the passengers. Just, what do we need? Keep the cabin calm, he said. Standard procedure for temporary communication disruption. Do not use the word malfunction. Do not use the word emergency. Answer questions honestly but without specifics. Can you do that? Yes, she said. Sarah. He used her name for the first time, and both of them registered it. If I need you back here, for anything, I'll send Marcus. She held his gaze for 1 second. Understood. And she was gone. His name was Director Raymond Holt, Senior VP of Operations at Atlantis Airways, and the kind of man whose entire personality could be summarized by his relationship with a spreadsheet. Intimate, obsessive, and completely devoid of warmth. Raymond Holt had 3 problems with Ethan Cole. The first was professional. Ethan had, 18 months ago, filed a formal incident report citing inadequate maintenance scheduling on a fleet of aging aircraft. A report that had cost the company a significant amount of money, a great deal of embarrassment, and had quietly derailed a very comfortable arrangement Holt had with a maintenance contractor. The second was personal. Holt had no power over Ethan and had never been able to find any. Men who don't want anything from you are extraordinarily difficult to control. The third problem was Sarah. Holt had been quietly pushing a very different kind of agenda where Sarah Malik was concerned. The kind of agenda that dressed itself as mentorship and career development, but was, in practice, neither of those things. He had been careful. He had been patient. He had been managing the situation the way men like him always manage situations, with the slow, bureaucratic patience of someone who controls the paperwork. He had not anticipated Ethan Cole. When Flight AR-407 landed at Heathrow, 3 hours behind schedule, following a nail-biting final descent using backup navigation systems and emergency visual approach procedures that would later be studied in aviation training programs across the world. Holt was waiting. Not to celebrate the safe landing. Not to acknowledge the extraordinary performance of both the flight crew and the cabin staff under catastrophic systems failure. He was waiting with a formal conduct review form, a company policy document open to a very specific clause about intercrew personal conduct, and the particular thin smile of a man who has been watching and waiting for exactly the right moment. The next 48 hours were the worst of Sarah's professional life. The investigation into the system's failure was standard, necessary, expected, but woven into it, with a skill that spoke of long practice, Holt had embedded something else entirely. A suggestion, careful and deniable, that Sarah's presence in the cockpit during the emergency had been irregular, that her interactions with Captain Cole throughout the flight had been unprofessional, that there were questions to be answered. He never said anything explicit. He didn't need to. Men like Holt had built entire careers on the architecture of implication. Ethan heard about it within hours. He sat across from Sarah in a bland Heathrow Airport hotel meeting room, both of them still in fragments of their uniforms, both of them exhausted in the specific way that comes not from physical effort, but from sustained psychological pressure, and he looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not his professional composure, not the focused stillness of the cockpit. Something raw, something that had clearly been assembled in a hurry and was not entirely holding together. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Are you asking as Captain Cole?" she said quietly. "Or as Ethan," he said. "Just Ethan." She looked down at her hands. "I don't know," she said honestly. "He's going to try to use this," Ethan said. "Whatever this is between us, he's going to make it small and make it dirty and make it something that it isn't." She looked up. "And what is it?" The silence stretched between them with the particular weight of something that had been building at 30,000 feet for 9 hours, and now, on the ground, in a beige hotel conference room under fluorescent lights, had nowhere left to go but forward. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I know it isn't what he's going to say it is." She nodded slowly. "Ethan," she said, and the way she said his name, quietly, without ceremony, like something she had been trying out in private and was using aloud for the first time, did something significant to his composure. "Whatever happens with the investigation, whatever Holt does, I need you to understand one thing." "What?" "You looked up from your checklist," she said. "I know what they say about you. I know that doesn't happen." She paused. "That mattered to me." He was very still. Then, in the voice of a man who was extremely unaccustomed to the territory he was currently navigating, "You said the sky looks different every flight." "Yes. I looked out the window on approach this morning. I haven't done that in years." She smiled. And it was the smile he had caught the edge of in the cockpit doorway, 9 hours and 30,000 feet ago, the one that seemed to come from somewhere quiet and certain, like weather that has made up its mind. "Good," she said. What followed was 3 weeks of what Marcus Webb later described as watching two incredibly stubborn people be absolutely correct about their feelings and completely useless about doing anything with them. The investigation concluded. The system's failure was traced to a faulty relay in the electrical bus, a maintenance issue that, with grim irony, bore striking similarity to the report Ethan had filed 18 months earlier. This was not lost on the Aviation Authority investigators. It was extremely lost on Raymond Holt, who found himself suddenly on the receiving end of the kind of scrutiny he had spent years directing at others. The implication campaign against Sarah quietly evaporated, but its ghost remained. Because Ethan Cole, who had spent 9 years building a fortress of professional distance between himself and every human being he encountered, found that the fortress had a crack in it now, and the crack was the shape of a woman who had stood in a cockpit doorway at 1:47 a.m. over the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and asked, "What do we need?" without a single tremor in her voice, and he did not know what to do with that. So he did what he always did with things he didn't know how to handle. He scheduled them, he managed them, he gave them appropriate professional distance. He ran into Sarah in the crew briefing room 3 days after the investigation closed and said good morning in his most precise captain's voice, and she said good morning back in her most precise flight attendant voice, and they stood there, two extraordinarily competent people being extraordinarily competent at each other, until Marcus walked in, looked at both of them, made a sound that was technically not a word but communicated a very complete sentence, poured himself coffee, and left. "This is ridiculous," Sarah said, the moment the door closed. "Yes," Ethan said. "You are the most difficult person I have ever met. I've been told. You landed a half-blind aircraft over the Atlantic with backup navigation by dead reckoning and emergency visual approach, and you filed an incident report that essentially dismantled a corruption network within this company's maintenance division, and you cannot manage to—" She stopped. Reorganized. "What are you afraid of, Ethan?" The question landed like a direct hit. He set down his coffee cup, looked at her with the focused, unhurried attention he usually reserved for instrument panels. "The last person I cared about left," he said very quietly. "Because I was always in the air. Because I am always in the air. Because the sky is the one place I have ever made sense and the ground—" He paused. "The ground is where I lose things." Sarah was silent for a moment. Then, "I live in the air too, Ethan." He looked at her. "I'm not asking you to come down," she said. "I'm already up there." They took it slowly. This was partly Ethan's nature and partly, Sarah recognized, a kind of care. The way you handle something you don't want to break. Coffee after briefings became dinner after layovers. Dinner became long walks through whatever city they happened to land in, Rome, Dubai, Singapore, Montreal, with the comfortable exploratory rhythm of two people who had spent years moving through the world efficiently and were learning for the first time to move through it slowly. They talked about flying, really talked about it, the way you only can with someone who understands it from the inside, about what it does to you, what it costs, what it gives. They talked about families and failures and the particular loneliness of a life conducted at altitude. Ethan talked about his mother, who had died while he was mid-Pacific on a flight he couldn't leave, and the guilt he had carried like extra cargo weight ever since. Sarah talked about the years she had spent trying to be the person her family needed her to be before finally, terrifyingly, choosing to be herself. They were, both of them, learning the same lesson from different directions. That loving something, someone, does not require you to become less yourself. It requires you to become more. Marcus, who received real-time updates from both of them simultaneously because he was that kind of person, told his wife over the phone, "It's like watching two tectonic plates decide to stop colliding and figure out they fit together." His wife said that was beautiful. He said he'd been saving it. Raymond Holt resigned from Atlantis Airways on a Tuesday in November, citing a desire to pursue other opportunities, which was the corporate equivalent of being escorted from the building. The Aviation Authority investigation into the maintenance irregularities he had overseen concluded with findings that were both detailed and devastating. He did not go quietly. He never did. His final act was a conversation with Ethan in the corridor outside the operations office, the kind of conversation that was technically civil and was in practice a grenade. "You should be careful," Holt said with the smile of a man who has lost but intends to make the losing expensive. "Company policy on crew relationships is very clear." "I've read it," Ethan said. "And?" Ethan looked at him for a moment, with the particular calm of a man who has flown through Category 5 storms and considers this a relatively mild weather event. "And I've also read," he said, "the Aviation Authority's findings on Section 7.4 of the maintenance contract irregularities, which I believe includes your signature, 14 times. Holt's smile thinned. "Have a good evening, Director," Ethan said, and walked away. Flight AR-119, New York to London, departing 7:55 p.m. Captain Ethan Cole ran his pre-flight check with the systematic, unhurried focus of a man entirely at home in his cockpit. Instruments nominal, systems green. Weather along the route, a minor front over the mid-Atlantic, nothing that would cause real disruption. The cockpit door opened. "Captain Cole," Sarah's voice warm and unhurried. "All 238 passengers are seated. Crew is ready." A brief pause. "And there's a rather spectacular sunset out the right-hand windows if you wanted to know." He looked up. She was already smiling. That quiet, certain smile that had started all of this, somewhere over JFK 9 months and 1,000 stories ago. "I see it," he said. Marcus, in the right seat, stared at the instrument panel with tremendous concentration and the expression of a man heroically minding his own business. "Coffee?" Sarah asked. "Black," Ethan said. "No sugar." "I remember," she said. This time neither of them was embarrassed by it. She left. He watched the doorway for a moment, not 2 seconds, not 5, but the full, unhurried length of time it took for the last edge of the sunset to catch the metal of the wing and turn it briefly, brilliantly gold. Then he looked at Marcus. Marcus looked back at him with the expression of a man who has been right about something for a very long time. "Ready?" Ethan said. "Been ready," Marcus said. Ethan took the controls. Below them, the city was already beginning its nightly transformation into light. Above, the first stars were arriving, punctual as always, in the darkening east. At 7:55 p.m., Flight AR-119 lifted off the runway and climbed, steady and sure, into the sky. And at 30,000 feet, exactly 30,000 feet in the cold and perfect dark above the clouds, Captain Ethan Cole, the man who didn't sweat, who didn't feel, who had once upon a time stopped looking out the window, looked out the window. The moon was rising over the Atlantic, enormous and unhurried, and the ocean below it was hammered silver, and the sky above it was the particular deep blue that exists only at this altitude, only at this hour, a color that has no name because it has never needed one, because it belongs entirely to here, to this, to the remarkable, improbable, beautiful fact of being alive and moving through the air at 560 miles per hour, and knowing that somewhere behind him, in a cabin full of sleeping strangers and waking dreamers, there was someone who understood exactly why that mattered. He smiled. It was a small smile, barely there, the kind that doesn't announce itself. Marcus saw it anyway. "There it is," Marcus said softly, mostly to himself. Ethan didn't answer, but he didn't stop smiling either. Some love stories begin on the ground. The best ones begin at 30,000 feet, where the air is thin, the stakes are high, and there is nowhere left to hide from the truth of who you are. And where, if you are very lucky and very brave and willing at last to look up from your instruments, you might just find that the sky you have been flying through alone has been waiting all this time to be shared.